The first of the classic War Eagles was the great P-38 Lightning fighter, designed and built by Lockheed. Though still a young company by the mid-1930s, Lockheed was already renowned for its technical excellence. Starting in 1927 with wooden aircraft such as the Vega, the company concentrated on light transports of very clean lines, offering high speed and excellent range for the period. In the early 1930s, Lockheed switched to metal construction with the twin-engined Electra. This also introduced retractable landing gear and a tail unit with two fin and rudder units. The Electra paved the way to the smaller but faster Electra Junior and the larger and faster Super Electra. The latter was also developed into the Hudson Maritime Reconnaissance Aircraft for military service with Britain's Royal Air Force. A key figure joining Lockheed's payroll at this time was the young Clarence L. Johnson. Kelly Johnson was a far-sighted aeronautical engineer, destined to play a dominant role in Lockheed's rise to become one of the world's most successful aviation companies, even after his formal retirement in 1975. But in the second half of the 1930s, Lockheed had little experience in building warplanes for the U.S. Army Air Corps, as the U.S. Army Air Force was called up to mid-1941. The Air Corps' newest single-seat fighter at this time was the Curtiss P-36 Mohawk, with an air-cooled radial engine. But only a limited number were built before the P-40 Hawk series, a more advanced development, with the Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled inline engine entered service in 1940. Maximum early speed was 345 miles an hour and a range of 730 miles on internal fuel. Armament comprised 6 .303 machine guns. Kelly Johnson, together with more senior Lockheed design engineers, such as Richard von Hake and Hall L. Hibbard, knew that Lockheed could do better, despite the company's comparative youth and modest size. In 1937, the company responded to an Air Corps requirement for a high-performance interceptor optimized for the high-altitude role against long-range bombers. Lockheed's proposal was the radical Model 22 design. In June of the same year, Lockheed gained an order for one XP-38 prototype, with provision for the very heavy armament of 4 50-caliber machine guns and 4 23mm cannon. Design work shifted gradually from pencil and ink drawings to more formal blueprints as the design was finalized. At the same time, the company continued production and further development of its family of low-wing monoplane transports. Wind tunnel tests of expensive scale models were conducted at the University of Michigan. These provided a mass of technical information. This data was of great value to the company's planned military aircraft as well as its civil transport series. By this time, the Lockheed plant at Burbank, California had grown into a major industrial organization housed in modern buildings with advanced facilities. Later, however, the threat of war would see the plant cleverly disguised by camouflage into what appeared to be a typical Southern California residential area. To achieve this effect, specially painted camouflage netting was carried on posts over every significant part of the plant to conceal the facility and to ensure continued aircraft production. However, this was in the future. In the first part of 1937, Lockheed had made its pitch to the Air Corps with the innovative Model 22. Even as company officials and Air Corps officers were discussing the technical merits of the new design, Lockheed was thinking about ways in which the production line could be organized and operated for maximum efficiency. In the absence of a single engine giving the required power, Hibbard's design team had opted for two V-1710 engines carried on booms and driving counter-rotating propellers. Each engine was boosted by a turbocharger to provide the required performance at altitude. What emerged, therefore, was America's first heavy twin-engine fighter. The agility of a single-engine fighter was sacrificed to outright speed and altitude performance, with notably heavy armament. With basic design work complete and the XP-38 contract signed, Lockheed's Burbank plant started work on building the prototype. There was really nothing wholly innovative in the XP-38 structure. It drew on the company's now considerable highly mechanized experience with light alloy sections. These were cut, milled, and pressed to create the sets of components. These component sets were then carefully assembled by the company's skilled engineers on the production line. As the airframe approached completion, the two V-1710 11 or 15 engines were bolted onto the front of the booms ready for their cowlings to be installed. Finally, their propellers would be fitted. The all-up empty weight of the YP prototype was 11,000 pounds. The weight of the final L and M models with upgraded 1,600 horsepower Allison engines was a massive 21,600 pounds. A total of 10,037 aircraft of the Lightning series would be produced. The Lightning was a very pleasing but comparatively large airplane. It was based on a dihedral and tapered wing. Each wing carried outboard ailerons and inboard flaps on its trailing edge. The two engine cowlings or nacelles at the front were extended backwards as booms that provided space for each engine's turbocharger. A broad tailplane connected the rear of the booms. The two oval section booms carried the engine nacelles at their front. The door-covered bays for the main landing gear units and the engine radiators and turbochargers were in their center, and the two vertical tail units were at their rear. The tailplane connecting the booms had a movable elevator, and the rear of each vertical tail fin was fitted with rudders. The advanced landing gear was of the tricycle type, and this proved its worth when operating in difficult weather conditions, such as those in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. The cockpit was located in a central nacelle, together with the nose landing gear and the fixed armament which fired straight ahead. The cockpit was conventionally laid out for a fighter, although, of course, with paired engine controls. Based on Lockheed's experience with commercial aircraft, the pilot flew the fighter using a control yoke rather than a central column stick. The Lightning had an armored glass windscreen. Extensive trials were carried out using a 20mm cannon, and these confirmed the substantial protection that the windshield offered. There was also an armored plate directly behind the pilot's seat. After some flutter problems had been solved, the Lightning proved to have good handling characteristics. Though the P-38 was not spectacularly agile, it presented its pilots with no particular problems. The definitive gun armament on the Lightning was one 20mm cannon with 150 rounds and four 50 caliber machine guns with 500 rounds per gun firing dead ahead, unlike all other U.S. fighters of the time, where the guns fired through the aircraft's propeller arc. This firepower was enough to deal with most German fighters and could shred the structures of the more lightly built Japanese aircraft. And the punch it could deliver could handle most ground targets. Two underwing hardpoints could carry drop tanks or bombs up to a weight of 1,000 pounds, or on later variants, 1,600 pounds of ordnance. Later aircraft also had provision for 10 5-inch rockets under the outer wing panels. The ability to carry bombs and rockets in addition to the fixed guns made the Lightning a potent weapon against surface targets such as parked aircraft, all types of ground vehicles, and even small ships. The XP-38 first flew on the 27th of January 1939, and on the 27th of April of the same year, the Air Corps ordered 13 YP-38 service test aircraft. The structure was revised slightly for easier manufacture. V-1710-27 and 29 engines, rated at 1,150 rather than 1,090 horsepower, were fitted, and the armament became one 37mm cannon, as well as pairs of 50 and 30 caliber machine guns. The first YP-38 flew on the 16th of September 1940. By this time, the new fighter had been ordered into production to meet British as well as U.S. requirements. Manufacture and delivery were at first slow, and the last YP-38 was not delivered until June 1941. A few aircraft with 2 seats speeded pilot training. The first full production variants were the P-38E and P-38F, the latter with 1,125 horsepower engines and provision for 2 underwing bombs. Later variants introduced steadily more powerful engines. By mid-1942, the Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor maritime reconnaissance bombers, operating in conjunction with the U-boat Wolfpacks, were the scourge of Allied shipping on the vital convoy routes across the North Atlantic. On the 14th of August, a P-38F based in Iceland with the 27th Fighter Squadron shot down a Condor. This was the first German warplane to be shot down by what was now the U.S. Army Air Forces. This U.S. success marked an early development in the Allied ability to operate against the German aerial raiders deep into the central Atlantic. Lightning fighters for the 8th Army Air Force started to reach Great Britain for the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups in June 1942. Some of the fighters were flown across the Atlantic by stages with the aid of drop tanks, while others were cocooned and shipped for assembly in Great Britain. Joined by the men of the 82nd Fighter Group in November 1942, the pilots of the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups were eager to get into battle against the Luftwaffe. The Royal Air Force was already prosecuting the bombing campaign against occupied Europe by night. But now, and for the next 3 years, the 8th Army Air Force would take the battle to the enemy by day. The task of the Lightnings was to escort Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers on their first daylight sorties over German-occupied northwest Europe, and then later, it was hoped, on longer sorties against targets in Germany itself. The bombers flew in boxes designed to provide a high degree of mutual defensive fire, and the boxes were staggered in altitude, width, and length, according to tactical schemes that were varied at different times. The bombers were armed with large numbers of 50 caliber machine guns and could generate a substantial volume of fire. But it was recognized that this fire could be useful only against German fighters that came within range. So, an escort of fighters was provided to tackle German fighters as they formed up beyond the bomber boxes before making high-speed firing passes. The bomber formation flew a course designed to avoid the heaviest concentrations of German anti-aircraft fire and to confuse the Germans about the likely target. The shorter-ranged fighters of the period, such as British Spitfires, operated a relay system so that useful numbers were always with the bombers at their times of greatest German threat. But the Spitfire Mark IX had only a combat radius of 220 miles on internal fuel, sufficient to reach northeastern France and the Low Countries. Complete surprise was almost impossible, for German radar stations in most cases spotted and reported the size, altitude, and bearing of the bomber formations. In its P-38L form, the Lightning eventually would have range on internal fuel of 460 miles. But this was not enough to allow the Lightning to escort the bombers very deep into German territory. It wasn't until the deployment of later War Eagles, such as the P-51D Mustang, with an incredible absolute range of 2,080 miles with drop tank, that the bombers could be escorted all the way to their targets in eastern Germany. Even so, the Lightning proved a useful but not totally successful escort. Its firepower was adequate, as a growing number of kills testified. But the Lightning lacked the agility to mix it with the opposing Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 single-engine fighters in any sort of turning engagement. The theater in which the Lightning started to come into its own was North Africa, from where the fighters began operating in 1942. Over North Africa, and then from July 1943 over Italy, the Lightning emerged as a first-class ground attack fighter. Roaming far and fast, the fighter's fixed and disposable armament allowed it to search out and destroy troop concentration, fighting vehicles, artillery, and dumps. The Lightning was also a good escort for the Douglas C-47 Dakota, that had by this time become the mainstay for Allied tactical transport and airborne forces. The Allied Mediterranean Air Forces, combining 2 numbered U.S. Air Forces and 2 British named Air Forces, controlled operations in this vast theater. In command was U.S. Lieutenant General Ira C. Aker. As in Northern Europe, a major role was entrusted to the heavy bombers. Here, once again, the Lightning had a major role to play in the escort of the bombers, as they started to rip the heart out of German and Italian capabilities in heavy daylight raids. Flying as a fighter bomber and in its F-4 and F-5 variants in the photo reconnaissance role, the Lightning was a warhorse of the air effort as the Allies landed on the European mainland from September 1943. The Lightning squadrons moved forward behind the ground forces. From here, they could respond swiftly to emerging threats, or loiter as long as possible over the front line to be called in when needed. The squadron's operating conditions were generally very basic, and this placed great emphasis on the skill and adaptability of the ground crews, who kept the aircraft serviceable under almost every adversity of ground and weather. Inevitably, there were aircraft casualties, but the ground crews showed great ingenuity and skill in cannibalizing these machines for spare parts to keep other Lightnings airworthy. With a Lightning declared serviceable, it was time to load its fuel. Up to 424 U.S. gallons were carried internally in 6 wing tanks. And when these had been filled, up to 600 U.S. gallons could be pumped into the 2 drop tanks that could be carried in place of bombs. Once all the fuel had been loaded, the fuel bowsers were withdrawn to a safe distance before any external ordnance was brought up. On shorter range sorties, when drop tanks were not needed, 2 500, 1,000, or 1,600 pound bombs could be carried. Once the bombs had been loaded, they were armed and then made safe by the fitting of a wire that prevented the nose-mounted arming rotor from turning. As the bomb fell from the Lightning, this wire was pulled loose, and the turning rotor then armed the bomb. As the ground crews checked, fueled, and armed the Lightnings, the pilots were being briefed and then headed off to their aircraft. The crews used every type of transport available. The trip to the aircraft might be relatively short, but the men's camaraderie was clearly evident. Upon arrival at his Lightning, the pilot was greeted by one of the ground crew before mounting his aircraft. Once on the wing, he recovered his flying helmet, oxygen mask, and mission maps. For many pilots, there was a final good luck pat for the personalized nose art, which adorned so many of the fighters. The pilot boarded his machine over the port wing route and then clambered into the cockpit with his parachute pack fitting into the seat. As the top of the cockpit was closed and locked, a pilot might take a last look at family photographs before passing these and any other personal items to a member of his ground crew. The carriage of personal material was banned on operational sorties in case it fell into the hands of the Germans. Finally, the pilot checked that there were no smears or other marks on the cockpit transparencies, and that all seemed well with the Lin 3 reflector gun sight behind the bulletproof windscreen. Once all the pre-flight checks had been completed, the engines were started, and each pilot taxied his machine out toward the runway and lined up for takeoff. On the signal from the control tower, the Lightning accelerated down the runway into the wind, lifted off, and as soon as possible retracted the landing gear and raised the flaps. Once all its aircraft were airborne and formed up, the squadron headed for its target area. Here, the pilots might have been briefed to attack and destroy a specific target, such as a German defensive position, or a bridge, or to roam in search of targets of opportunity, such as road and rail transport. From what had originally been designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, the P-38 Lightning had developed into a superb low-level attack warplane. Diving attacks were often made to maximize speed, simplify bomb aiming, and reduce the target area visible to German anti-aircraft gunners. Once the Lightnings had returned, each was turned over to its ground crew once more to be readied for the next sortie. Nicknamed Hub and praised by General Jimmy Doolittle as the 8th Air Force's greatest fighter group leader, Colonel Hubert Zemke claimed 17.75 air combat victories. While leading the 56th Fighter Group, which pioneered the P-47, Zemke developed considerable leadership and tactical skills. He also urged that fighters should not be tied to the bombers they were escorting, but instead given roaming remit to search out and destroy German fighters, and this proved successful. In August 1944, Zemke was transferred to lead the 479th Fighter Group, the last P-38 outfit in the 8th Air Force. The group was one of the least experienced in the 8th Air Force. Zemke capably passed on the lessons he had learned with the 56th Group and was instrumental in developing his pilots' tactical skills, 2 of the group's pilots becoming Lightning aces before the group converted to the P-51. As long as the weather was right and there was sufficient daylight, the Lightnings were ready to head out in search of the German targets and defenses that might hinder the advance of the ground forces the fighters were supporting. Limited use was made of the Lightning to tow the Waco CG-4 Hadrian assault glider. And so the Lightning's ground attack war continued, the most spectacular results coming when an ammunition truck or train was hit and exploded, or when the boiler of a steam locomotive was punctured. The sound, and then the sight of the Lightning at low altitude, came to be something the German forces feared, both on and behind the front line, and they nicknamed it the Fork-tailed Devil. No matter what the terrain was or the type of weather that prevailed, the Lightnings seemed almost always to be there and make their presence felt with devastating effect. And if the sound and sight of the Lightning were things that struck fear into the hearts of the Germans, their presence also heartened the Allied troops that these powerful fighters were supporting. The Lightnings were there as the Allies drove northward through Italy from September 1943, south and then east across northern France from June 1944, and north up the Rhone River in southern France from August 1944. And as the Allies closed in on Germany and then punctured its border defenses to drive deep into western Germany, the Lightnings kept up their good work. By this time, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The P-38s continued their war of attrition against any aircraft that they could catch on the remaining German airfields. Soon the Allies would have total air superiority over Northern Europe. The other theater in which the Lightning distinguished itself was the Far East in the war with Japan, which had made huge advances between December 1941 and mid-1942. Even more so than in the war with Germany, the advantages enjoyed by the Lightning were its good firepower, strong structure with good protection for the pilot and essential systems, and the reliability offered by its twin-engined power plant. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese Naval Air Force's most important fighter, in technical as well as numerical terms, was the Zeke. This was the Allied reporting name for the Mitsubishi A6M Ryzen. This last meant Zero Fighter, and the A6M also became known to the Allies as the Zero. Captured and repaired examples of the Zero were put through their paces by the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit. This was a joint U.S., Australian, and British unit, and its pilots and engineers assessed the Zero in Australia and then in the USA. Designed as a long-range fighter for operation from aircraft carriers and land bases, the Zero was moderately well-armed and had adequate performance. The Zero reflected Japan's belief that the fighter's most important attribute was first-class dogfighting agility, rather than high outright performance, structural strength, and defensive features such as armor and self-sealing fuel and oil tankage. The ATAIU rated the Zero as an excellent dogfighting airplane as a result of its low wing loading and comparatively high power loading. This meant that the Zero possessed superior capability in a turning engagement and generally had a higher climb rate at lower altitudes. On the other side of the technical coin, however, the ATAIU's evaluation confirmed that the Zero was too lightly built to survive anything but light combat damage. The evaluation also revealed that the Zero was not as well protected as contemporary Allied fighters and possessed lower rates of acceleration in both level flight and the dive. Evaluation of the Zero by technical teams was paralleled by comparative flight trials. The Allied types against which the Zero was flown in mock combat included the land-based Lightning and carrier-borne fighters such as the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, Grumman F-6F Hellcat, Supermarine Seafire, and Vought F-4U Corsair. These trials confirmed that while the Japanese fighter and its Allied rivals each had their particular advantages and disadvantages, in general, the more highly loaded Allied fighters had the edge when flown by experienced pilots using the right tactics. The primary advantages enjoyed by all the Allied fighters were greater strength, much better protection for the pilot, and key elements of the airplane, generally higher speed, and far superior dive and zoom performance. Translated into combat tactics, this meant that the Allied fighters should avoid entering any form of turning engagement with the Zero and other Japanese fighters. and instead make slashing attacks in the form of high-speed dives through any Japanese fighter formation before making a zoom climb back to altitude. The Zero was by far the best naval fighter in the world at the time of its introduction in 1941. Captain Eric Winkle Brown, one of the ablest of the British test pilots, concluded that, "I don't think I've ever flown a fighter that could match the turn rate of the Zero. The Zero ruled the roost totally and was the finest fighter in the world until mid-1943. The primary exponent of the Lightning in the Southwest Pacific area was Major General, later Lieutenant General, George C. Kenney's U.S. 5th Army Air Force. This supported General Douglas MacArthur's land forces in their drive westward along New Guinea's coast and then north to the Philippine Islands. U.S. pilots soon learned from combat experience how to exploit the capability of the Lightning, and a classic victory came on the 18th of April, 1943. On this date, Lightnings of the 18th and 347th Fighter Groups make a long flight to ambush and shoot down the 2 bombers and 5 of the 6 escorting fighters, delivering Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, on an inspection visit to an island base in the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto was killed, and the course of the Pacific War was arguably changed. Just as important as the Lightning's numerically superior fighter variants were the F-4 and F-5 photo reconnaissance models. In these, the nose-mounted armament was removed to provide volume for camera equipment. Flying fast and far, the reconnaissance aircraft were the eyes of an Allied air effort that became highly skilled in the rapid generation of timely intelligence. The Lightning's ability to maintain flight on just one engine was of literally vital importance to pilots operating over the vast sea, and great land areas in which jungle and mountain meant that a forced landing was likely to be fatal. Perhaps even more so than in Europe, ground crews had to be meticulous in the maintenance of their aircraft and the armament on which the offensive capabilities relied. After each mission, cleaning the guns in the nose of the Lightning was vital to remove fouling by any residue of burnt explosive powder. Extemporization was required right across the board, and this was as true of accommodation as of maintenance. The fuselage of this wrecked Curtiss C-46 Commando transport, for example, was adapted as a workshop. As the land forces leapfrogged forward along the coast of New Guinea and then invaded the Philippines, they had the benefit of powerful tactical air power. This air power operated from Japanese airfields, which were among the first objectives earmarked for capture. After their seizure, these airfields were improved to cope with the larger, heavier, and more numerous U.S. aircraft. other airfields were carved out of jungle and coastal coconut plantations, and boggy surfaces were overlaid with metal matting to provide safe maintenance areas and adequate runway lengths. The Lightning operated from such airfields, often only a short flying time behind the front line. As Japanese fighter strength was steadily whittled away, the Lightnings could be switched increasingly from the air combat role to ground attack, in direct support of the U.S. Army's infantry and armored formations. As in Europe, control of the air had been wrested from the Japanese and was, by now, in the hands of the Allies. Lightning pilots became extremely skilled in the location and destruction of Japanese strongpoints. These were carefully concealed on flat ground and in hillsides. Pilots also searched out and destroyed the light coastal and river vessels on which the Japanese relied for the movement of men, equipment, and supplies in areas deficient in major road and rail networks. Progressively, Allied air power began to dominate the skies over the Pacific. There were many Lightning aces in the war against Japan in the Pacific, and to a lesser extent Burma and China. Captain Harry H. Seeley was a 10th Army Air Force ace who flew over Burma. These Far Eastern Lightning experts included the two highest-scoring U.S. aces of World War II, Richard I. Bong with 40 victories, and Thomas B. Maguire with 38 victories. Bong joined the U.S. Army Air Corps in May 1941 and in September 1942 reached Australia to join the 49th Fighter Group near Darwin. As a pilot of the group's 9th Fighter Squadron, Bong achieved his first two victories over New Guinea on the 27th of December as the Lightning made its debut in the Southwest Pacific area. By the end of March 1943, Bong's tally had risen to 9, including 6 Nakajima Ki-43 land-based fighters, and to 11 by late July. Then on the 26th of July, Bong claimed 4 fighters and another 2 days later. Out of combat for 2 months pending the arrival of more aircraft, Bong returned to action in October. He gained 5 more victories by early November before he left for the U.S. on leave. Bong returned in February 1944 and received a roving commission to fly where and with whom he liked. Bong now accelerated the pace of his air campaign, raising his score to 27 by mid-April and thus becoming the official U.S. top scorer. Sent home again, Bong undertook an advanced gunnery course and then returned to New Guinea in September 1944 as a gunnery instructor. Bong, in fact, continued to fly in combat and scored another 5 victories during September, 3 in November, and 5 in December, raising his score to 40. Bong was now flying over the Philippines, where on the 12th of December 1944, General MacArthur presented him with a Medal of Honor. The citation read in part,
"For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, above and beyond the call of duty, in the Southwest Pacific area, from 10 October to 15 November 1944. Though assigned to duty as gunnery instructor, and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty, Major Bong voluntarily and at his own request engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the Leyte area of the Philippines.
Though he scored no more air-to-air victories, Bong was heavily involved in ground attack and anti-shipping operations over and round Leyte. He was then taken off operations once again and sent back to the USA in January 1945. Here, Bong became a test pilot on the new Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star jet fighter. But taking off in one of these aircraft on the 6th of August 1945, just before the end of the war, he suffered an engine flameout, crashed, and was killed. As an escort in the Pacific Theater, the Lightning had as its primary charge the consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bomber.
Pilot to crew, check in. Over. Place gun, okay. Tail gun check. Billy turret getting set now. Mr. Gun, okay. Pilot to navigator. What's the word? Navigator to pilot, approaching target. Check. There it is, the end of the line. Place gun to pilot. Back at 7 o'clock. Coming in close. Okay, Jimmy, I see it. Pilot to bombardier. Take it over for the run. Right. We're making the run. Bomb base open. Keep heading 340. Easy. Hold it. Mr. the pilot, phosphorus bombs popping all over the place. Yeah, they're getting our range. We've been hit. There goes our left inboard. Alpha reader calling formation leader. Rear reader calling leader. Inboard engine gone. Looks like we gotta leave you. Over. Well, there they go. Pilot to crew. We're on our own. Bandits bouncing from 9 o'clock high. Bandits bouncing from 9 o'clock high. Finding on through. Stay with me. Hang on. You nicked him. Got him. Keep pouring it in. I got him. I got him. He popped. Still coming. Get that one diving through. Got him. Nice going. Watch it. Bandits out of the sun. home, big friend. We'll take care of you. This Lightning's a terrific, eh? Control tower from Army 127. Control tower, over. Army 127 from control tower. Go ahead. Clear the field for crash. Army 127 from control. Try to make it on runway 2. Land east to west. Over. Wilco. Nose wheel's gone. Start sweating, friends. We're coming in. Lightning 67. Request emergency landing. Lead plane on fire.
It was not all one-way traffic, however. The Lightning proved very successful, but also suffered its share of losses. Many of these losses were the result of non-operational factors, but most resulted directly from enemy action or the damage sustained in combat. Many damaged aircraft managed to return to base, often on only one engine, and of these, large numbers survived a crash landing. But on occasion, the Lightning was too heavily damaged to survive the landing, and either broke up or caught fire on impact with the runway. It was among the greatest tragedies of air operations in World War II when an aircraft managed to return but then crashed with fatal results. Ultimately, though, the P-38 Lightning played a huge role in the Allied victory in World War II. It was the only U.S. fighter that remained in production throughout the war. But other, even greater War Eagles were to follow.